Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining today. We're going to give it 1 minute while we see people populate the Zoom. My name is Sarah Lefton, and I'm the Chief Development Officer at UJA Federation in Toronto. And we're really grateful that you've joined us today. So we'll give it just 1 minute as we see everybody populating the Zoom here, and then we will get started with our panel today. Okay, just looking at the numbers coming in. Again, welcome to everybody. This is a call that we actually are hosting across Canada today. We have Jewish community members across Canada who are joining us, and allies who as well are joining us for this really, really important conversation. So thank you to everybody. I see the numbers that are still really climbing. So we'll just give it 1 minute and then we'll get settled and we'll jump into the program. Thanks so much, everybody. Okay. So, out of respect for everyone's time, we're going to jump in now. Again, thanks for joining. We have people from across the country. This is an initiative done through CJA, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, who's the advocacy agent of the federations. And also, we have many of the different Jewish federations from across the country participating in the webinar today for a very, very important conversation. Thank you to everyone. Again, my name is Sarah Lefton. I'm the Chief Development Officer at the Federation in Toronto, and really thrilled to have brought this conversation to the broader Canadian community. So today we're going to dig right in for a conversation on an incredibly important topic and not one that is relevant only to Iranians and Iranian Canadians. This is something that is so unbelievably important for the Jewish community and for other communities around the world who share similar values and want to fight extremism. This is something that ties us together. I know so many of you from across the country have been standing with Iranian Canadians who want to express their anger and their fear about the regime that is in place in Iran. And I know even in UJA in Toronto, we had a group of donors and activists and volunteers who went out just this weekend to march in solidarity with our Iranian peers and stand up for values that hold us together. So, we know also that Iran is completely central to regional escalation. We know that Iran has been at the center of so many of these big, big geopolitical conflicts, including everything that Israel has been facing. We know that so many issues of global security trace back to Iran. And we also know that even Canadian foreign policy has had some of these questions at the center of them, and rightfully so for decades. So today, we're going to have a conversation with a number of experts in this space. The goal today is really to provide some clarity through three, I'd say different but complementary lenses. One, we have with us an Iran expert from Foundation for Defense of Democracies, FDD, who I'll introduce in a moment. We also have the Israeli perspective with Michal Kotler, and we also have Noah Shack with us, who's here to talk about Canadian implications and Canadian foreign policy and what we've been doing here. So I really want to thank the three of you for joining us today. I'm going to start actually with introducing Michal Kotler-Wunsch is a prominent public speaker. Many of you have heard her. She's been doing tons of media, not just since October 7th, but before. Michal, so thrilled to have you here with so many Canadian roots and as an Israeli and all the things. She's really also been a strategic advisor. She's worked in independent policy, intersecting issues of anti-Semitism, law, human rights, and Zionism, of course. Michal was actually born in Israel and grew up in Canada, so she's got roots in both. And she received her law degree from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and her LLM, her Master's of Law, from McGill University in Montreal. And she's also, very importantly, and has spent time with us, especially after October 7th, in this capacity. She's the former special envoy for combating anti-Semitism in Israel. So not only does she have experience looking at the issues relating to Iran, but she has experience in Canada and obviously on the important issues of fighting anti-Semitism globally, something that more and more has become such a important focus of our community. We also have an expert on Iran, Ben Taleblu, who's on the line with us today. Thank you. Share him in one moment. Ben Hum is the Senior Director of FDD, Foundation for Defense of Democracy's Iran program, and a senior fellow specializing in Iranian security and political issues. He has more than a decade of experience at FDD alone and a background in non-proliferation policy, and he focuses on Iran's nuclear program. So also many questions coming to light there that we can ask. He's an expert in regional security, the IRGC sanctions on Iran, and internal politics of Iran, which right now are unbelievably important as we explore the internal dynamics. It's not just what the rest of the world sees, but what's actually taking place on the ground in Iran. So we're going to hear from Ben Hum about that. He frequently briefs policymakers and legislatures in the US and Canada and the UK. And actually, his analysis is very widely cited in international media. So, Ben Hum, thank you so much for joining us. Last but certainly not least, we have Noah Shack on the line, who many of you are familiar with. Noah is the CEO of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, CJA. Noah is more recently in the role within, I guess, Noah, about a year ago now, and not quite. And Noah's been working in Canadian 6 months. I mean, Noah and I have been working together in Federation and CJA for more than 20 years. But Noah has decades of experience in Canadian public policy. He also has background working in Washington at a think tank on issues that are very similar to this. He has a master's degree from London School of Economics, actually also in this particular area, and really is a huge benefit to the Canadian Jewish community, not just with his advocacy leadership in general, fighting anti-Semitism, but particularly on these issues. So Noah, we're really thrilled to have you with us today, and we will dive right in. I just want to suggest to everyone, just let everyone know, we received many questions from people who are registering for this webinar in advance. So we've tried our best to sort of amalgamate those questions and bring them together to use when speaking with the panelists today. So thank you to those of you who sent in questions. And if you have any follow-up questions or any questions after the call, please don't hesitate to reach out to us and let us know, and we'll do our best to follow up right after the call. So we're going to speak a little bit about Iran's internal dynamics first. And I guess I'd like to go to Ben Hum first and just give us a bit of a situation. We have people on the call right now who would say they're very familiar with what's going on. We have other people on the call who know that there is a crisis. They know that we're at potentially, hopefully, a turning point. But if you could just level set with everyone and give us sort of a very basic understanding of what's going on in Iran on the ground, and also how that's translating here in Canada, that would be a great place to start off. So over to you.
Well, absolutely. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Greetings. Great to join you virtually, and thanks for having me on the virtual stage. We are indeed at an inflection point, not just in US Iran policy or even North American Iran policy, but perhaps more importantly, an inflection point in the 47-year battle, in the 47-year-long history of the Islamic Republic. And that's a battle for power between the state and the street. You have an Islamist, authoritarian, and octogenarian political and military and religious elite in Tehran. And across the country, you have a young, secular, and nationalist population. And there has been something of a national divorce going on for a little over a decade, for those of you who have been watching Iran and Iranian politics and are familiar with the fact that the forcing function that got us to this crisis, that got us to this precipice, which is in potentially war starting precipice or potentially deal making precipice, was protest in Iran. And not just any old protest, but the kind of pattern of protest that you've been seeing out of Iran, again, for roughly the past decade, is not for a particular change in economic policy or domestic policy or foreign policy, but to push past the system in its entirety. The pattern of street protests in Iran over the past decade is basically to ride on a political issue, sorry, on an economic issue, an environmental issue, a social issue. You may remember Women Life Freedom from 2022 to 23, for example, to ride on any of these issues. You may remember in 2020 January, the downing of the Ukrainian airliner that had so many Canadian Iranians on it. Riding on any of these issues for the population to turn out on the street against the state and to voice their discontent in its entirety with the state in its entirety. So we've been seeing boom and bust cycles of protests that are increasingly more demographically and geographically diverse. And that brings us to the fact that in this most recent round of protests, which started on December 28th, triggered by an economic crisis, sustained by the larger political crisis and confidence and the larger divorce between state and society in Iran, you had protests touch all of Iran's 31 different provinces, and you had a very demographically and geographically diverse spread of protesters to include even 1.5 million protesters in Tehran in early January, to include just under a million in Mashhad in early January. And for those of you who've been watching how heavy-handedly the regime has been pushing back on this attempt by the street to take over the state, you may know that the past 3.5 weeks have been perhaps the most significant challenge from the street against the state. That's why the regime used such violence that is absolutely unprecedented in the 47-year history of the Islamic Republic, but also in the past century and a half, if not 2 centuries of contemporary Iranian history. Uh, 36 to 43,000 people have been killed largely under the cover of darkness, largely under the cover of an internet blackout that had been going on in Iran for 20 days. And it was against that backdrop that US President Donald Trump rode the fact that he actually gained support in his first term by talking about the Iranian people, by changing US policy to stand with protesting Iranians, by believing that actually, if you lend rhetorical and political support for protesting Iranians, that this would not be the kiss of death, that this would actually be welcome. Some of you may know, for example, that at the end of his first term, Donald Trump had the most liked tweet, the most seen tweet written in Persian in the history of Persian language Twitter because of his forceful support for Iranian protests in the past. So riding that into the second term, and with this geographically and demographically diverse spread of protests, the president promised that the U.S. was locked and loaded. The president promised to make Iran great again. The president promised that help was on its way. And depending on how you count, between 8 or 9 times drew a red line, not about the nuclear issue, not about the missile issue, not about the drone issue, not about sanctions busting, not even about transnational terrorism, and not even about the larger Israel-Iran war that has been operating in the background since October 7th. He drew a red line multiple times about the crackdown from the street, from the state against the street, and promised to hold the government of the Islamic Republic accountable. And that's precisely why we are in such a critical inflection point where the US may now be pivoting to talk about a potential nuclear deal as an off ramp or potential missile limitations as an off ramp. But against this bloody backdrop of the murder of the most pro American, of the most pro Israeli, of the most pro Western population in the heartland of the Muslim Middle East, I believe there is no such thing as a diplomatic off ramp, as a nuclear deal off ramp, one that particularly scrapes and scrabs at old wounds, either in US politics about the 2015 deal, like the JCPOA, or about America and Israel's wars or involvement in the post October 7 Middle East. So, in my view, there is no way out but through. The president has drawn multiple red lines. To not adhere to these red lines would be a strategic mistake for the United States in terms of its credibility. Same for also major Western partners like the Five Eyes countries, like Canada, like the UK, like Australia, like New Zealand, like the European Union, which just followed in America and Canada's footsteps to prescribe the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in its entirety as a terrorist organization, but also morally, because the president personally encouraged some of these protests. And God forbid we find ourselves in a Hungary 1956 or an Iraq 1991 situation.
Thank you so much. That's a great context. I have about 50 questions I'd like to ask you to follow up, but let's jump over to Michal for a moment. I also forgot to mention Michal's obviously her newest title and newest leadership role, which is truly so exciting after she finished her term as former special envoy for combating anti-Semitism, and that's now as the CEO of the International Legal Forum. So, Michal, we're so excited to have you again in this role. I feel like we've been working with you, and you've been in Canada in the last couple of years, really working as a champion for these issues in media as well. And thank you. So, I guess to kick off, Michal, from your perspective, how's this playing out in Israel on the ground? I mean, we obviously see Iran's proxies, like we see the day-to-day impact on Israel's security. But if you can walk us through the reality, the day-to-day reality of Israel and dealing with Iran's proxies, and B, sort of not projecting the future, but sort of projecting the future, and what the different scenarios are that Israel could find itself in as things progress.
So yeah, first of all, thank you. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for all those who have joined to engage in this, what I believe is as was said, an inflection point and actually an existential moment for our shared civilization. And I actually think for the world as we know it, and the urgency that you've heard in my voice for the better part of the last 2 years as Israel's special envoy for combating anti-Semitism has transitioned into this role as chief executive of the International Legal Forum. I'll say a couple of words about that in a moment, but just to answer your question, look, Israelis have been under direct attack by Iran and its proxies since October the 7th, 2023. We have experienced war in a way that I was just trying to say to somebody today, as I, sort of was in a meeting in North America, well, on Zoom in North America. We have a challenge in making accessible to our allies and people who may not realize they're our allies, but are under attack by the same, I'd say, axis of evil of which the criminal Islamic regime in Iran is a very significant partner in. The understanding that what we are facing now is this impending sense of doom, meaning people actually have to factor in not just the weather and maybe a snowstorm, not just traffic, but literally being under attack. And I'll share with you and with those that are listening that the 12 days of direct attack of ballistic missiles being launched indiscriminately, each one of those missiles, just so we're clear, is what's known in the language of international law as a double war crime, indiscriminately targeting civilians from densely populated civilian areas. I have to share with you on a very concrete level, those were of the most frightening 12 days of my own life, and I'm not so young anymore. So, on a very personal level, what Israel is bracing itself for, as has been clearly expressed, is the prospect of being once again on the front lines or continuing to be on the front lines of what is a raging war, openly declaring intent to destroy the foundations of democracies, if you will, to destroy our shared civilization and build on its rubble an alternate reality on which I think most of us do not want to live. So, in that sense, it's just a much more urgent, you can hear it in my voice, moment of reckoning that I think our responsibility is to make accessible to those in the West that may not realize that our daily plans are literally shaped by what it is that may develop. And we're waiting to see what it is that develops. I want to say the people of Iran, as I said, actually 1 month after October the 7th in the UN, in a hearing that I called Never Again is Now. Let it be clear, never again to anyone, not just never again to us. But for that to have any meaning, it requires those countries and institutions such as the UN itself that were entrusted to uphold, promote, and protect an international rules-based order equally and consistently to stand by that responsibility. And what we have seen is actually the failure of the responsibility to protect by the international community. It was just said the EU just last week decided that they will in fact designate the IRGC alongside Canada and some other countries. By the way, the UK still has not made that decision to designate. That's like me saying, stating the obvious has
Yeah.
suddenly become something that we have to commend. So that is where we stand in Israel. It is something quite concrete. It's something that we feel in the everyday managing of what it is that we make the decisions to do with our lives, including travel, including everything you can imagine. And then there is that resilient piece of Israeli existence, which somehow goes on as if everything is ordinary, going to school and work and school and businesses are open as usual. And maybe we'll have a little bit more time where I will be able to elaborate from an international law perspective why this should matter well beyond the state of Israel, as I said, just on the front lines of this raging war in our shared civilization.
Yeah, Michael, I will come back to that. We would love to hear more on that. Let's just turn to Noah for a second and talk about Canada. Noah, do you want to talk about how some of this has spilled over into Canadian society, where we're actually seeing the influence of the Iranian regime in Canada, and also like what would strong Canadian leadership look like in this space? I mean, what can we hope for?
Well, obviously, the threat from the Iranian regime is first and foremost felt by the people of Iran, thousands of whom have been massacred as they demonstrate and stand against its brutality with ferocious bravery. But Canada is not immune. And as Michal pointed out, the Western Alliance is not immune. It's the same Iranian drones that are attacking Israel and are attacking Ukraine. It's the same Iranian agents that are attacking Iranians on the ground in Iran and intimidating Iranian Canadians here in Canada, and who the Australian intelligence services directly linked to arson attacks against the Jewish community in Australia. This is a pervasive threat that we shouldn't consider as something that is happening far away across the world, but something that we need to care about as Canadians. And the fact that there are reports of more than 700 regime-linked people here in Canada should make us all pause. We have a notoriously poor record of removing people from Canada who should not be here. And now is a moment where the government needs to focus on ensuring that the threat to Iranian Canadians is being targeted directly, that the people who are linked to the regime who should not be here are removed. And as the prospect of regime officials fleeing increases, that Canada doesn't become a safe harbor for them to come here and to continue to terrorize Iranian Canadians going forward. We need to make sure that our borders are being protected from the influx of Iranian agents with alacrity. Michal pointed to the listing of the IRGC, and it's an important point that Canada has already listed the IRGC as a terrorist organization, along with a number of Iranian terror proxies. Unfortunately, we haven't been as good as a country in making sure that there are consequences for being listed as a terrorist entity, and that the full weight of the state is brought to bear to prevent fundraising and financing activities that are happening here, and a whole host of activities that are being undertaken here in Canada by listed entities with impunity. So more needs to be done, more resources need to be put into all of this. And I think there's one other thing that should make Canadians' blood boil, even beyond all of this, which many on the call will be aware of. But the Iranian government has directly targeted a former Canadian justice minister who's beloved to all of us on this call, perhaps, and I would hazard more so by Michal, Erwin Kotler being her father. And that should be something that causes national outrage, that this regime would deliberately and willfully target one of our nation's treasures, a former justice minister of this country.
Thank you. Noah, I'm going to come back to you in a few minutes after we've gone back to some of the other panelists, because I would at some point like to talk about what we can be encouraging Canadian Jews to do to stand up and support the Iranian people through this. I think we have obviously been going through our own really tough times where we've had to find different ways to influence, and I think there are other communities who are turning to us now for support. So I'm gonna come back to you on that. Just to go back to Benham. I think we should dig a little bit further on some of the details in terms of what's going on. Can we talk first just a little bit more about the proxies, Iran's proxies? How influential are they right now? Like, how connected are they? Is Iran kind of doing its own thing at the moment because they're so underwater, or are they still kind of acting through the proxies?
Well, when we're talking about proxies, we have to talk about their long arm, which is traditionally in the past decade and a half, how they've been trying to get back onto the European continent, onto Australia, and back into North America, as well as the more militarized kind of direct terror proxy militia activity that we've seen really encircle Israel over the past 2-3 decades in the Middle East, possessing a ring of fire. In the Middle East, post October 7, but post 3 different cycles of violence of the direct Iranian-Israeli missile exchanges of April 2024, October 2024, and June 2025, you can say with a fair amount of confidence that Iran's proxies are down, but they're not out. The Islamic Republic is betting that the neutering of Hamas, Hezbollah, and to a lesser extent the Houthis by Israel, and to a lesser extent by the US in the post-October 7 space is something that can be rebuilt slowly, incrementally, through first financing, then political support, and then again surging material support when propitious conditions based on domestic politics in Israel or domestic politics in America refocus the attention away from their near abroad and away from their foreign and security policy back onto their own homeland. So Iran is waiting and trying to quote unquote build back better when it comes to the axis of resistance in the region. It is, again, so long as you have an Islamic Republic at the helm in Tehran, they will be looking to use the constellation of failed states and jurisdictions of weak central authority that are now scattered throughout the Middle East to be able to contest the West, to target American bases, to target international forces, and perhaps most importantly and acutely for the purposes of this call, to be able to export their revolution and sharpen the knife that they've already placed against Israel's neck. That's the longer geopolitical play. It's obviously much, much, much harder for them. They lost their sole state patron in the region, Syria. They've had, the military capabilities of their different proxies rolled back. But again, the strategy, the thought process here is down, but not out. And that's why when you're hearing talks about potential inclusion of regional issues and proxies in these alleged negotiations that may happen as early as Friday in Turkey with an international coalition in the Americans and the Iranians, I have cause for concern because if at best what is on the table is a mere political promise by Tehran to not arm, to not train, to not re-equip these groups, that is nowhere near sufficient. And again, that just free rides or rides roughshod on the back end of the 36,000 plus Iranians that were killed. So I believe there is no proxy deal, no militia deal to be had here. Pivoting just briefly further afield, we've seen a change in the way Tehran supports transnational terrorism and in particular engages in this phenomenon that Canada has been a leader in, thank God. And I think many other G7 countries, many other Five Eyes countries should be taking a play from. And that is how Canada has been putting the spotlight on Iran's transnational repression. Rather than work through the traditional armed proxies and the diasporas and the agents and the affiliates of each country's armed proxies, Iran increasingly has been working through transnational criminal syndicates, basically local mobs, guns for hire in jurisdictions like in Australia, across the EU, in the UK, but especially in Canada and especially in America. And here in America, where I live and work over the past decade, decade and a half, the Islamic Republic has tried to work by, with, and through everything from as diverse as Mexican drug cartels to Eastern European mafias, to even Canadian biker gangs, to kill dissidents, defectors, Americans, and Iranian American journalists on US soil. And lest we forget, this is a regime that literally placed a bounty on President Trump's head after he killed Qasem Soleimani, Iran's chief terrorist, in January 2020. They re-upped that bounty and actually tried again to get a gun for hire when Trump was a candidate in 2024 for his second term. And in 2025, after the 12-day war, this is a regime which, taking a page from their religious-inspired terrorist playbook here, actually issued several fatwas against Trump, against his property, and even against the female members of his family. Unfortunately, I think you know what that is for, following the 12-day war. So this is a regime that is trying to, A, bolster its regional terror proxies, B, work through transnational criminal syndicates, and C, by having these broad religious edicts out there, try to press and play upon the cleavages in our own diverse societies here in the liberal West to have us fight each other rather than have them come and continue to fight. So for these three reasons, the terror proxy threat is down, it's diminished, but it is nowhere near out.
So, but Ben, if we just go a little bit further on that before we move on. So it really does sound like there's like a race against time, if we speak, right? Like there's this moment where the proxies are somewhat weakened, right? We don't know how long it's going to take for them to build back up, but we know they're trying. And as you said, like they are growing. The idea is that they're going to be strengthened eventually. But for Hezbollah, for Hamas, for these different organizations, at the moment, it's not that it's a reprieve, but like, between the IDF and what everyone's been doing, there's definitely an opportunity now, and alongside of what the people in Iran are doing, this uprising, there's a real moment. So I guess I want to pull out something you said in your first set of remarks. You said, in your opinion, there's no opportunity to have an off ramp right now. So no off ramp, no walking back. This isn't about nuclear conversation, negotiations and things like that. So if the only way through is through, if that's the only way, and we have a moment right now, and we have, as you've just said, a very obvious threat, not just to Trump personally, his regime. Like you've bad actors who have sort of come into all of our different countries. Like, what is slowing people down? I'm going to ask you to
What is,
predict
sorry, what is the,
what is slowing Trump down. Like, look, what is the thinking there? And I'm asking you to predict and explain Trump's administration's actions. So that's not always easy, but genuinely, like, what is their thinking? Why are they making some of these strategic choices, knowing what the threat is and knowing that there is actually a time-bound moment right now?
can I just flesh one last bit of that
Yeah,
transnational terrorism point and then pivot to this? I'll keep it very
yeah.
pithy, I promise. Um, like we all mentioned, and I think especially Mikhail mentioned the shared adversaries that we have, this long arm of terror, unfortunately, has also come back into Iran. Not one, not two, but three US designated foreign terrorist organization in Iraq have, this is not my reporting, this is not diaspora drama, because we have heard allegations of Arabic being spoken among security forces in various rounds of protests dating way back to 2009, but particularly in 2019 with the flood protests. But three US designated foreign terrorist organizations that have American blood and coalition blood on their hands from the experience that was Iraq have in early January crossed into the border in Iran and were present for the crackdown. CNN has even reported the crossings that these militias went through to go into Iran to support, again, that militarized crackdown from the state against the street. So when we talk about having shared allies, Americans, Jews, Israelis, the Iranian people, it's because we also have the shared adversaries as well. And this is, again, more proof of that linkage that that same long arm that goes abroad to aggress is the same long arm that comes home to repress. And to make this about US policy, I believe I believe in doing the best we can as individuals and doing right, and that might is not right. That there is an actual clear non-relative goodness. But also, I understand foreign policy is about limited ways, limited means, limited ends, and being able to rank, order, and prioritize your interests. To quote Henry Kissinger, foreign policy is not missionary work. It is not missionary work for the Trump administration to go bail out the Iranian people or to have the Israelis bail out the Iranian people. We are lucky that we are now dealing with a conflict that allows us to align our strategies and values in the Middle East, which usually absent Israel, there aren't many places in the Middle East where you can marry your strategy and your values. Usually the West liberal democratic values are in tension with the state's national security strategy and the declared philosophy and worldview of that state. So to kind of bring it back into your question here, Sarah, fundamentally, I think the Trump administration is doing what all previous administrations said that they were doing, which is to explore all options on the table. But as we saw in 2025, Donald Trump went through four different options in 6 months' time. He did maximum pressure sanctions. He tried to do nuclear negotiations. He backstopped Israel militarily. He used military force against the crown jewel of the regime's nuclear program. And then he supported a multilateral effort at the United Nations for snapback sanctions. So he ran the gambit of the economic, political, and military options against Tehran. And I think if we look at the past, his preference for the use of force is short, sharp, and decisive. And I think he has struggled to find the political win that follows the use of force that could allow it also to be short, sharp, and decisive. And I also think that while as amazing as it was to have that declarative rhetoric and red lines out there, the US force posture in the region was nowhere in early January what it is today on February 3, 2026. There's at least 12 additional vessels. There's the carrier strike group, the Abraham Lincoln. There's at least a guided missile destroyer for missile defense in the Eastern Mediterranean. There's more missile and air defense assets in the region. So the US is able to more credibly act given this evolving architecture. The problem is the Islamic Republic is still home to the largest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. And the Trump administration is going to have to struggle with defending targets versus the nature of operation. What is not clear here is the administration has not picked the political end to which military force could be applied. Is this force just containment for a better deal? And human rights was just a fig leaf? I certainly hope not. Is this for just deterrence by punishment, to simply live up to a red line, to say you struck something and then to go home? Is this decapitation a la Venezuela and musical chairs at the top? To which I would say the Iranian people didn't come out for you to play musical chairs. They're pushing past this regime in its entirety. Or is this defanging? There's a school of thought in Israel that they can recommence the 12-day war and targeting missile systems, to which I say, yes, we need to nullify these long-range strike systems. But if we think that we're paving the pathway for Iranian protesters in Tehran by striking a missile based in Yaz, we have another thing coming. So it is unclear right now what political end the Trump administration has picked. And I think they like having us guessing. If past this prologue, Trump likes having the allies guessing and the adversaries guessing. I think they did the right thing in 2025. It came with some ups and downs. Unfortunately, I think there's a lot of people taking a snapshot approach to all the news and all the leaks and all the emotions and all the tweets. I think we have to take a little longer view, like a video approach. And so that's the only caution that I would inject into the conversation here.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting you say that. I completely agree. I think it's sharp, it's short, and I think if anything, we've seen that we can't predict, and I do think there's a bigger plan. But you're right. I think it's hard to follow necessarily by looking at these individual moments. Michal, I want to come back to something that you were talking about before, which is the international community's perception of this, and also how international law plays in. I think, just speaking on behalf of so many community members who I speak with in a week, in a month, we are beside ourselves. I'm sure I'm speaking for almost everybody on this webinar right now when we say we're beside ourselves when we watch what's happening and we also watch the silence. So the Iranian people are suffering so horribly. And we understand, as Benham says, the shared threat. And this is a real shared threat. This isn't something that we're trying to connect the dots for people. I mean, like this kind of radicalism is going, and you've just heard, it's coming to us in our streets here. And it's not something that's just facing the Iranian people. This is, as you say, and this is why it's such an important opportunity for us to stand together. It's the moment where the entire, it's not just Canadian Jewish community, it's so much broader. It's the world needs to stand together against this kind of radicalism. And so we've heard silence, so much silence, which is not just sad, it's dangerous. So I guess, Michal, if you can comment a little bit about that. I know the perception in Israel must be different. Talk about the international community and also talk about like international law and how this all sort of relates in the sense that we would expect to see the international legal community up in arms right now, and they're not.
Look, I'll say about this as well, just following up on my previous comments. This is not new for us. Meaning,
Yeah.
I'll speak for myself on the front lines of what was an 11-year and 3-month struggle to return deceased soldier Hadar Golden alongside deceased soldier Oron Shaul and civilians Avera Mengistu in Hisham Asayed that were held in egregious violation of an internationally brokered ceasefire. These words may make sense to you when you remember what we've just seen now. Internationally brokered ceasefire that was actually violated day after day after day by what is considered a standing violation in the language of international law. That means that every minute of every hour of every day of every month in which these 2 deceased soldiers and 2 civilians were held for about 11 years returned. So now we mark the fact that there are no more Israelis left in Gaza held by a genocidal terror proxy of the criminal Islamic regime in Iran, that is Hamas. But that took 11 years and 3 months, and I'll say very little moral clarity or courage to say this is an egregious violation of law, an egregious violation of agreement, an egregious violation of all that the international rules-based order was entrusted to uphold, promote, and protect. And the very same responses that we saw in international institutions, in academic spaces, on streets, online, to the October 7th massacre, war crimes, and crimes against humanity that waged the multi-front war openly intent to annihilate the state of Israel, is the responses we see now to the slaughtering of thousands of Iranians. Responses of silence, responses of false moral equivalency, responses of impunity, responses that actually, I just came back from London where I gave a talk. When you look on the streets with people literally holding up signs of the butcher of Tehran that say the right side of history, you rub your eyes, you say, you can't be. George Orwell couldn't have made this up. This Orwellian inversion of fact and of law that has actually been part and parcel, when you ask me about international law, of the continued failure of the international community. And the reason that I say that is, of course, I had no expectation of genocidal terror proxies of the criminal Islamic regime in Iran to uphold international law or human rights. Who I have an expectation from is actually democracies, is actually the West, is actually the international institutions, the UN, ICC, ICJ, entrusted to uphold, promote, and protect. And it's that failure, it's that impunity that has emboldened this axis of evil, this criminal Islamic regime in Iran and its proxies to actually continue in its openly declared intent to annihilate not only the small devil, i.e., Israel, but the big devil, the United States of America. That is the part where I try and make accessible. Anti Semitism is not a problem of Jews. Anti Semitism is the siren that sounds and that should be sounding to all who understand that what it predicts or enables to predict or is a sign of is extremism, whether it comes from the extreme right, the extreme left, the extreme Islamist, key word being extremism. That is what, in the words of the late Rabbi Sachs, actually is the most reliable sign of a major threat to humanity and freedom and the dignity of difference. And so when we have people on this call that are looking for what to do, it's not just standing by your friends, your allies. It's understanding that this targets you yourself, meaning there is this silent or silenced moderate majority. I draw a great deal of hope from that because everywhere I've traveled, especially in the past 2 years, I meet people that are silent or silenced, where I say, this is the time to be boots on the ground. It's the time to call out those that are marching in the streets with the sign of the Butcher of Tehran as the right side of history. It's the time to actually say, this is not about free speech. By the way, very many of those instances of speech are actually violent conduct, harassment, intimidation, where the double standard in, for example, identifying and combating anti Semitism has been so blatant. But again, anti Semitism just as a symptom and a weapon in this unconventional war for public opinion that systematically hijacked and inverted and redefined and weaponized international law and human rights, the infrastructure that was created to uphold, promote, and protect post World War II equally and consistently. So the failure there is actually one that I believe each of us have a responsibility to not only expose and call out, but combat. And as we live in democracies, that means in every democratic measure available to us, engaging our elected officials, in engaging with organizations like CJA in the action that we ask our governments to take and hold to account for, whether it's in university spaces, in city spaces, municipal spaces, on the streets, in online spaces. And so the work is, really ahead of us is much more than we've even begun to, I believe, process. But I think that there is a lot of room for action and for courage in, as we move forward.
Thank you, Michal. I know I'm going to come to you in a minute to continue what Michal's just been talking about, which is what we can do as a Canadian Jewish community. But Michal, before we do, can you tell everyone on the call a little bit about the Jewish community, such as it exists in Iran today? Like, what is the size of the community? Are we hearing anything from them? Is Israel? I mean, there's only so much you can say on a public call, but like, what do we
Yeah,
know about them?
we're very, very careful not to speak. There are,
Yeah,
family members
yeah,
of people who live in Israel and in other places around the world, and mostly, I think we just have to be very, very careful,
yeah.
assuming that we
What?
know that they are targets.
Yeah,
As many others are, of course, but that they are targets. There is this funny thing with anti-Semitism in its modern strain, that is anti-Zionism. And actually, the criminal Islamic regime in Iran uses it, the differentiation, alleged differentiation between Jews and Zionists, right? If you look at Khamenei's Twitter feed, sorry, X account, you will
yeah.
note that what he uses interchangeable with Jew is Zionist, right? The Zionist cancer, the Zionist entity. There is a reason for that. By the way, it enables us to then connect the dots and understand that Zionist just codes not just Jews, but anyone who believes in Israel's right to exist. So anti-Zionism as the modern strain of anti-Semitism, this is my silver lining. I don't have that many, but the silver lining means that actually the subset of targets of this modern mainstream strain of what is an ever mutating lethal virus, i.e., anti Zionism, actually targets a much larger subset. You
Mhm.
need not be a Jew to be the target of this ever mutating lethal hate. And maybe, in that sense, there is a need to prove that, Jews too, because it's not about them having their religion as Jews that makes them a target. And hopefully we have as many who are indeed safe and able to continue in whatever capacity they can live in Iran. And again, I think that it was said before, the courage of the people of Iran is not just something that we should be taking for granted. the courage of the people of Iran that have been impoverished and tortured and slaughtered and denied basic rights for this genocidal regime's goal is something that we, I think, in the West especially, need to be very much in tune with and understand that they cannot win this war alone. They cannot do this without the support of those alleged human rights warriors around the world that have been so silent, so missing, so emboldening of the regime with the impunity that they've given it over decades.
Thank you. And I think all of what you've been saying and sharing leads us again back to the reality that we're in right now. With this is no, it was never just about the Jews, but now the world has an opportunity to really see that this is no longer about the Jews. This is not the Jews. And so that's where we need, the activist in me says, like, this is the moment to go broad and say to people, we should never have looked away, and you cannot look away if it's just the Jews. You cannot look away if it's anybody. But right now, we're looking and saying, everybody, like, wake up, look at what's happening to the world, right?
And connect the dots. Meaning
Yes, we have to, and we have to
connect the dots.
I agree. And I think as Jewish community leaders, as so many of us are on this call, whether you're a professional, you're a layperson, you're a volunteer, you're someone who just speaks to your friends and family at dinners, like, this is the moment to do what Michal's just said, to connect the dots for people. We can't assume that people see what we see, and we can't assume that people understand the connection in all of these different spaces and all of these different threats. It is actually one threat connected together, and it is up to us to connect those dots. So I'm going to go over to Noah for a second. Then I'm going to ask everyone to do a bit of a lightning round here for some final thoughts. But Noah, talk to us a little bit about the Canadian Jewish community, and just to share, we as a federation system have invested so heavily, obviously, in CJA, our advocacy agent, and the work that you're doing. At all three levels of government, in provinces across the country, but also in mobilizing our own members of the Jewish community and our allies. We've also made, I'm sure many on the call know, a significant investment in an organization called Allies for a Strong Canada. Allies for a Strong Canada has recruited more than 10,000 and well over 10,000 non-Jewish community members in more than 230 ridings across Canada to also speak out and speak up and band together with members of the Jewish community to make our voices heard, to fight this kind of extremism. So Noah, from CJA's perspective, what can we be doing?
Well, obviously, all of this is taking place against the backdrop of a rupture in Canada-US relations. And I'll refer to a speech that another president in 1961, JFK, gave before the Canadian Parliament, in which he quoted Edmund Burke in saying that all that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. And if we're looking at the systems of repression manifest by the Iranian regime, they rely on a small base of support and on fear and apathy to maintain their grip. And really, that's how extremism flourishes. This is not the time for apathy. This is not the time for fear. And I am incredibly proud of the Jewish Canadians who have stood up all across Canada to walk shoulder to shoulder with Iranian Canadians in every part of this country, demonstrating for freedom in Iran and against the extremism that regime represents in Iran and, of course, here in Canada as well. So first and foremost, speak to your Iranian friends, neighbors, coworkers, colleagues. Go out to demonstrate solidarity with the Iranian Canadian communities and the broader Canadian community. I mean, more than 100,000 people were out in the streets of Toronto this weekend. This is a movement that we ought to be out in full force supporting, not only because of what it represents in terms of what's happening in Iran, but in terms of the message that's sent about us not being willing to tolerate extremism here in Canada as well. But you don't have to go out and brave the cold. That's not the only way to do this. We have launched an email campaign encouraging members of our community and beyond to write to the Canadian government, urging concrete and urgent action to support the people of Iran, to hold the regime accountable, both internationally and domestically here at home. It's very easy to participate in this. Go to actionhub.ca, and with a few clicks, you can send an important message to the government to make sure that they understand that this isn't just a news story. This isn't just something that matters to one specific community in Canada. This is something that a broad swath of Canadians are standing up and saying should be a priority, and that the moral compass of Canada needs to be on full display right now in support of the Iranian people and in standing against this extremist regime that not only threatens the people of Iran, it threatens the people of Canada, and it threatens the world.
Thanks, Noah. I agree. I think to the extent that everyone on this call, doesn't matter age, stage, where you live in this country, there are ways for us to stand together with other Canadians. Yes, Iranian Canadians, but also there are other populations that are feeling threatened right now and that have been similarly threatened by extremism. And I've heard from a number of them from across the country who are looking for our support and our guidance, frankly, as members of the Jewish community who do a better job organizing and have a strong diaspora, and they need our help. They need our support right now. So the more that we can share, the more that we can reach out beyond our networks, our day to day. And again, as we were saying before, connect the dots for people on what's going on, I think the better. And I know the link was just shared, Noah, for the action alert. So if you can take a few moments, this is the easiest thing you can do. But please add your name, please send letters, raise your voice, get involved, and be an activist, even if you haven't been before. So I will, I'm going to ask each person to take us through a couple final thoughts. And maybe if you can, I guess two things. The first, we'd love to hear, what are you watching really closely in the next 60 to 90 days? Like, what should we be paying attention to? I want everyone on the call to go, okay, they told us when we're watching the news, here are the kinds of things that we should be watching for to sort of make our own, or have an informed opinion about what's going on. I'd say number two, and I always ask for this, speakers who we bring on these platforms, what are some really basic messages that we can share with our either peers, friends, like everyone Noah's just been saying we should be speaking with, right? Like what are the basic facts that we can share with, I'd say Canadians, but it would go the same way in America, the UK, and other places to say, this is a real threat. It is a shared threat. And to have people pay attention. Like, what are the couple messages that we might be able to share? I wonder if Ben, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start with a few maybe basic messages or observations. Iranians have been protesting often, but this time it truly is different. One, the scale of the crackdown is unprecedented from the state against the street. You have to go back to things from the Holocaust themselves to find the mass violence levels that occurred within a 2-day period. I'm senior director of the Iran program at FDD. I try very, very, very hard not to draw comparisons between every single moral and human tragedy that has occurred in the 20th century. But when we're looking at the numbers reported alone, that tragedy is really the only thing that stands in comparison, Babi Yar in particular, for the scale and the tightness and the tight timeline of the crackdown from the state against the street. So one, this is unprecedented, not just in the Islamic Republic's history, but contemporary Iranian history, but also the 20th century massacres that we have seen. So if you care about that from a purely humanitarian perspective, I would point you in that direction. The second is, and I'll just kind of get this off my chest because as a first generation Iranian American, I don't work in the diaspora, but I live and breathe amongst them. And there is a big Iranian diaspora in many countries. There's no shortage of diaspora drama or infighting, but one of the things that this differentiates this current round of protests in Iran is that traditionally you'll have protests and you'll know what they're against. Seldom do you get to hear what they are for. And we can have all our individual political opinions, but one cannot at all hide the fact that this go round, there is a sharp cleavage drawn between nationalism and Islamism, between the state and the street. And in particular, you cannot ignore the slogans being chanted for the exiled crown prince, his family, and even the legacy that pre-1979, even with its imperfections, represented. So there really is an option. Those who say there's no alternative, there's no opposition, there's no cohesion, they ignore, by the way, now that we're on a call with friends from the Jewish diaspora, they ignore actually the drama and the infighting and the history and the diversity of how Israel was actually formed. And then they make the perfect the enemy of the good when it comes to, again, the Iranian people. So I would highlight those two messages, that this is the most unprecedented crackdown, and two, that there actually is something that of an alternative. And it's not an alternative foisted by the West, but actually being chanted in the streets of Iran. And you couldn't have a better sign that this regime is on its deathbed when in the birthplace of the founding father of the Islamic Republic is a small town of Khomeini in central Iran. That's where Ayatollah Khomeini was born. There are chants of Javid Shah. There are chants of Long Live the King. You couldn't have a better referendum on this system. It's really damning what that says. And then in terms of things to look out for, obviously be on the lookout for negotiations, be they direct or indirect, between the US and Iran. To look out for diplomatic spoilers, how America's traditional partners in the region are hedging more today than ever before. They're auditioning to play the role of mediator. I find that to be actually highly problematic. Three, I would say obviously a conflict. If the decision to use force by America or Israel is actually authorized, look for the political ends to that conflict. What is the goal of the military force? And I would say, four, keep your eyes on the streets, what the Iranian people do and what the Iranian people say. Do they turn out? Do they not turn out? It's unlikely that coterminous with war they would turn out. But just like we saw less than 6 months after the 12-day war, Iranians came onto the streets because they too, like us, saw that the Ayatollah has no more clothes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Michal, over to you, and would love to hear your thoughts and also how you think is what the people of Israel and Israeli leadership is looking out for.
So I'll just say, from a global perspective, look, I mean, we've been here before, and everybody quoted a leader, a great leader of our past, and I will quote Churchill saying, you were given the choice between dishonor and war. You chose dishonor, and you will have war. I do think that we are at just such a moment with a regime that if we will continue to appease, and by we I mean the West, then we will have war. It is not something that I think we should take lightly at all. It was spoken about my own personal sort of the suffering of transnational aggression to what is probably, for me, one of the most devastating, knowing that it is a human rights icon for Canada who fought for the freedom of so many around the world that is now under house arrest in his own home in Canada. That is a problem for Canada. That is not a problem for Jews. That's not a problem for Israel. It's not a problem for Iranians. It's a problem for Canada. And I would be able to replicate that with every country across the West if I were able to, have this kind of conversation with communities around the world. So I do believe that it is the urgency that you hear in my voice is the one with which we should be treating this moment with. And I'll say that in that sense, it has become a moment in which I speak about, and it was said before, look, a regime of terror actually lives off the fear, the despair, and the distrust that it is able to indoctrinate its own population with and spread around the world. Now, that means that we have our call to action because we need the precise, exact actions that enable the foundations of democracies not to collapse. With despair, distrust, and fear, the foundations of our shared democracies will collapse. And in that sense, it is hope. And with that, I'll sort of end so that we end somewhere with not just an action item, but also with a sense of hope that I really do feel. But it is hope in which I always quote the late Rabbi Sachs, the former chief rabbi of the UK, in which he differentiated between between optimism and hope, and said that optimism is the belief that everything will be okay. But hope is the belief that we together can make it okay. In that sense, optimism is a very passive virtue, whereas hope is a very active one. And it takes not very much courage to be an optimist, but it takes a great deal of courage to have hope. And as we speak in this sort of sense of not just the Jewish community coming together with our Iranian friends and allies, but in fact, in that sense of the hope that has carried our people for thousands of years through all trials and tribulations. And in turn, we carried that hope. And as the national anthem of the state of Israel that you asked me about is that Hatikva, is the hope, then I believe that we very much have to focus on that notion of action and courage that each of us have a role to play in, each of us being boots on the ground on this eighth front. And as for us in Israel, I think that what we will be looking for, certainly for myself, and I'll speak here, is a little bit of what was spoken about, and that is the forces that are moving in to replace, including on our own borders in Syria and otherwise, including Qatar, including Turkey, Muslim Brotherhood, very, very concerning alternative, no better, by the way, than the criminal Islamic regime in Iran from our perspective. And so for me, anti-Semitism becomes a looking glass, not because it's the single and only issue, but because it becomes that predictor of the extremism that threatens the foundations of democracies that we all cherish. And therefore, that is the call to action, not only from Israel, but I think in Canada and globally.
Thank you, Michal. And in our last minute, Noah, over to you.
So I won't share messages. I'll just direct everyone to go to actionhub.ca where we have messages that you can rely on and actions you can take. And over the next period, to look out for more ways that Canadians can stand shoulder to shoulder with Iranians and against this extremism, which this is one manifestation of that we need to address if we're going to have hope for our future here in Canada and in lockstep with free people around the world.
Perfect. Thank you, Noah. And if I can just ask my colleagues to share the link to an email address for maybe Laura or someone on our mobilization team at Federation in Toronto. I can speak for the Toronto Federation when I say we've been sending groups, as I said, to stand with our friends in the Iranian community and march with the people of Iran on the weekends at some of these rallies that are taking place. It is deeply comforting for them to see members of the Jewish community coming out to be with them. So if you'd like to get involved, if you'd like to join us, please send a message. I know you can reach out similarly to other federations across Canada who are on this call today, and or to CEJA. And we're happy to at least let you know where to go, how to maintain your own safety and security, but also standing up for what you believe in and standing with our, frankly, other people where we share the similar threat. So thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate it to our panelists, Michal, Ben, and Noah. We are deeply grateful. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.